Well, he sure knows how to stick you in a hole, that's for sure. My name's Steve Mitchell. I'm an alcoholic. I told him that Wallace and I were in California a while back at an AA thing, and they had us on a stage about a half a block away from the people. And it's really hard to talk. But anyway, did I say my name? It's good to be here. I've been coming here for a long time. I think I was the third speaker when this group started, second or third speaker, and been coming here for a long time. Brings up a lot of thought. I spent a good bit of the day with Tom and Fern today, and makes you think about a lot of stuff, I'll tell you. So it's a funny world we live in. Anyway, I've got a sobriety date. I've got a home group. I'm a member of the principals group of Alcoholics Anonymous in Raleigh. We're on 1725 North New Hope Road. We're one group that meets 2 times a week. We've got a closed meeting on Tuesday night, and what we do on the first Tuesday night of the month is we study the book Alcoholics Anonymous. The second and third Tuesdays we take topics from AA literature that are common to all alcoholics in their quest for sobriety. On the fourth we do a tradition, so we cover the traditions every year. And on the fifth, there's a fifth, we study Alcoholics Anonymous history, believing our history collectively is as important to us as a group as mine is to me. What did the wise man say? If you forget your history, it's getting ready to happen again. And then on Thursday night, we have an open speaker meeting. And if we have a fifth Thursday like we do this month, we have a workshop. I've got a sobriety date. It's May 26, 1975. Seems hard to believe. The way I would describe that is long days and fast years. I was at a meeting one time, and they asked this guy, how long have you been sober? He said a long time, 30 days. I could identify with that. But it really is good to be here. The great Tom Ivester quote, "You won't be any smarter when I'm done here tonight than you are right now." I like to be very mindful of the fact that AA meetings and AA ain't the same thing. Meetings are just one thing we do in AA. A lot of the problems we have in Alcoholics Anonymous are associated with the idea today that many people think AA meetings and AA are it. That's it. Meetings are just one thing we do. And left alone to meetings, an alcoholic in my description will probably die from the illness of alcoholism. So what Alcoholics Anonymous is, it's made up of many parts of a great whole, and it practiced as a way of life. No 12 steps, no Alcoholics Anonymous. No identification, no Alcoholics Anonymous. If you take the identification from the illness or the destructive nature of the family illness out of what we're doing here tonight, then we're just like any other group of confused people. We've got everything known to man going on, but if we come together around the illness of alcoholism and practice principles to keep that at bay, then something happens that all the rest of our life falls in place. So if we take the 12 steps, you know, I was thinking about this today. I was telling my wife this. I've been at some things lately where people that have been sober, like, I don't know where they were at 15 or 16 years ago when they got sober, but they're describing AA as a place that was much harder, much more in your face, like get in the car, shut up and get in the car, do what I tell you, and all of that. Nobody ever said anything like that to me. I never heard anything like that. I was here 20 years before people now are saying that's what they heard. I've never heard anything like that. What people told me that Alcoholics Anonymous practiced as a way of life makes it impossible to drink alcohol. That if I were to describe what alcoholism is, what alcoholism means to me, and what I was taught, it means I can't live with drinking and I can't live without drinking. If you take alcohol out of an alcoholic of my description and don't give me any new way to live, then that's where the real trouble starts. I mean, you don't have to be around here very long to know that the majority of alcoholics, if you put everything in percentages that make sense, alcoholics commit suicide at a rate many times more sober than they do drinking. I know a guy that runs one of the largest Skid Row missions in the world, and he said he's never known an alcoholic on Skid Row to commit suicide. Now, you could argue we're committing suicide in all kinds of other ways, but to actually take their own life, we don't have to do that if you ever meet somebody, I spent my last couple of years of drinking homeless. It was after Vietnam and after I'd gotten out of the military and all that stuff. But if you talk to somebody who's homeless, not just somebody who's down on their luck and they're in a Skid Row mission, but somebody who's living that way for a period of time, the first thing they tell you is what they used to be. And the reason for that is because the dreams are all gone down there. There is no more fight. It's just that's why they talk about what they used to be. So what I'm going to do tonight, it's going to take me a couple hours here. I'd be all by myself, wouldn't I? When I first came to North Carolina in 1989, this guy told me, he said, I'd like to give you some advice if I could. I lied and said, that's all right. As far as I know, we rarely take advice when we ask for it. Unsolicited advice is worthless. But this was true at that time. It's not true now. But at that time, I came to North Carolina in 1989. And at that time, most AA meetings in North Carolina started at 8 o'clock. And this guy said, you never have to be alone in Alcoholics Anonymous in North Carolina unless you talk 5 minutes after 9 at night. And I'll tell you, I had an experience with that's true. I had a guy with me. This is years ago. It was in 1994. I was actually speaking at that, I don't know what you call that club over there, Daniel. What's that place called? It's the AA club here in Aberdeen. I was actually speaking there. Well, I got done at 9 o'clock. But that guy and I were talking to a brand new guy at 5 minutes after 9. Now, I'm not lying. They shut the lights out. They had some stuff to do, didn't they? I mean, there's no sense doing. I know nobody's ever been drunk after 9 o'clock at night on a Saturday night in Aberdeen. We've got to get out of here. So, but I'll be mindful of the time. I'm up on all that. Little story that I think it has relevance to alcoholism. You ever notice, like even when you see the fights on TV? I used to follow boxing. I don't know much anymore, but whenever you see the fights on TV, a lot of times you see a Catholic priest down at ringside watching the fight, have on his stuff. And I was at the fights one time, and you've seen athletes like step up to the free throw line or in the batter's box and cross himself like that. Well, every time the bell rang when this fighter stood up, he crossed himself like that. So there was a drunk down in the front, and he wandered over to this priest, and he said that guy that's doing all that, he said, that's one of your boys, ain't it? So the priest said, well, he appears to be a Roman Catholic, yes. And he said, well, what is that he's doing? He said, well, he's blessing himself in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. And the drunk said, what I want to know is, will that help him? The priest leaned over and said, it'll help him if he can fight. And that's kind of how Alcoholics Anonymous is. I go to Central Prison now on Monday nights, but we used to go to Polk. And there was a guy, I really admire this guy. He's still living. He's almost 90 years old. But he's the first person in his family to ever graduate from high school. And he went in the Marine Corps when he was a kid. He got out of the Marine Corps and he went in the Army, became a paratrooper in Special Forces. He stayed in there 20 years, got a big education. He's retired now as an NC State professor. But he's a religious volunteer at Polk. He's a good guy. And he asked me one night after the meeting, he said, how many of those young men in the AA meeting does this work for? And I said, well, there's not much secret in what we're doing. It works for 100% of them that do what they're supposed to do, and it doesn't work for any of them that don't. So what I would say is, what alcoholism means to me is I can't live with drinking and I can't live without drinking. And what Alcoholics Anonymous means to me, it's a way of life, if practiced as a way of life, and all the arteries are put in place, it's more powerful than the illness of alcoholism. So AA is made up many parts of a great whole, and probably the tradition, we have a lot of traditions that are not the 12 traditions that were read here tonight. One of the main ones is that Alcoholics Anonymous is a written program, but it's passed on through an oral tradition, but it's written down. If you read Bill Wilson's writings, he never wrote like that again, the way they wrote in the big book. Bill was very, very open and almost otherworldly in a lot of his stuff. He was open to almost anything. And very far-reaching, far ahead of his time, very down the road looking, but he never wrote the way he wrote in the big book again. The big book is written in such a way that it goes right. It's very grabbing. It'll tell you what to do, and it'll tell you what happened to you if you do what you're supposed to do, and very often it'll tell you what will happen to you if you don't do what you're supposed to do. And the 12 and 12 that he wrote, I don't know, 12 or 14, 15 years later is much different. It's much broader. But both are very worthwhile. So Alcoholics Anonymous is a written program. But what I'm going to do tonight is I'm going to try to share my experience, strength, and hope a little bit. I'm going to try to, for Waylon's sake, I'm going to get in and out of Bill's bar quick. And I'm one of the few people that escaped that place. Most people escape that by the penitentiary or the graveyard. Have you ever seen one of those bars where you could back a farm truck up to the bar and put everybody in there and take them to AA and you wouldn't miss a person? Even the people that worked in there were drunk. Bill himself had made his fortune in the garbage and septic tank business, and he bought that bar as a toy for his drunken wife, Phyllis. Now, we had some colorful characters in that bar. We had a guy named Vibrator Hartman, and Vibrator got drunk one New Year's Eve and burned up in a fire. We had a guy named Rodney Montani. Rodney got drunk, got in a fight with a guy in a wheelchair, tipped him over. And the way Rodney described that, he said, he hit me a good one, Steve, but I tipped him over before they got me out of there. You know how people, when drunks get drunk, they get louder and louder? Well, when Rodney would get drunk, the drunker he would get, the quieter he would get. And eventually his mouth would move, but no words would come out. We had another guy in there named Leonard Larson. Now, Leonard had no neck. His head sat right on his shoulders. And what Leonard would do is he'd get drunk and crawl around on his hands and knees and lift bar stools up over his head to perform feats of strength. He used to get me to jump off bar stools onto his stomach to perform feats of strength. But Leonard, Nebraska now, metropolitan, if you've been there, metropolitan Omaha is big. It's a major city, and it's hilly, but Nebraska is flat, and it's farm country and ranch country. The railroad is big there, and the tractor-trailer industry. For years, we butchered more cows than pigs in Nebraska, and they called them bull haulers. The tractor-trailers, and they would do 48 states and Canada hauling bulls. But there's a lot of old laws on the books. So Leonard gets drunk one day and goes out in the country, and he leaves his pickup truck on the road, wanders into a field and shoots a cow. So he's got to get somebody to help him load it in his truck, so he stumbles out to a country road, waves down a car that's coming by. It's an off-duty deputy sheriff. So Leonard ends up getting 1 to 2 years for that. Now, I don't know if there's anybody in here that's ever been to Blackstone in Virginia, the roundup. Anybody in here been to Blackstone? It's one of the oldest AA roundups in the country. I guess they've lost their place now where they meet, but I was only there once, and the year I was there, Wallace, you've been to Blackstone, haven't you? No? They should have got you to speak there, Wallace. It must have been an oversight. I was only there once, but the year I was there, I happened to be the Saturday night speaker, and my wife was with me. Now, she's not an alcoholic, but I'll say this. I've learned over long, hard experience, if at all possible, it's a good idea to do what she says. Just learned that over time. So the year I was there, they had a seat for us right down in front, and then the meeting was like they had us up on a stage like in California. And so it's 2 or 3 minutes to 8. The meeting's going to start at 8 o'clock. I'd already climbed up there. And the people that were chairing the meeting were up there. Well, my wife's frantically calling me down. Come here, come here. So I climbed down there, and she leans over, and she's serious too. She said, I don't want to hear one word out of you about that guy that ain't got no neck. And I said, what are you talking about? And she said, I mean it too. I don't want to hear one word. And I said, what's wrong with you? And she said, look at that guy over there. He ain't got a neck. But the two most colorful guys that came into that bar, I had just got out of the military. I went in the military in 1968. I got out the summer of 1972. I was in there 1 day less than 4 years. I had just arrived at Bill's bar, and 2 brothers came in there named Billy and Tommy Walker. Now, you know how you know something even drunk, but you don't know how you know it? When I first met Billy Walker, he told me he was just out of the 101st Airborne. Now, I knew that day that was a lie. I knew that Billy Walker was coming from a penitentiary somewhere. There are symptoms to that stuff, just like there are to anything else. If you meet your soulmate at 1 a.m. in the morning, and you end up with her for 2 or 3 days, and she tells you that she's single but she's really married, there's symptoms to that. It comes out over time. Trust me, I got experience with that. And but anyway, he told me he was just out of the 101st Airborne, and now at that time I'm a beer drinker. But I'll drink anything, right? And that was time, literally, I could drink beer for 24 or 30 hours. I'd be drunk, but I could remember stuff. I could talk to people. I could drive a car. But you let me take 1 drink of whiskey or 1 drink of Mad Dog wine, I just never remember anything. Now, when the Walker boys showed up, Billy Walker drank dry gin and chased it with squirt. Squirt's just a kind of soda. It's actually in North Carolina, but you don't see it much. Tommy Walker drank bar whiskey and chased it with water. Well, when I started drinking with him, I started drinking that dry gin and chasing it with squirt. Now, this is the kind of brains you had in Bill's bar at that time. This is what Billy Walker told me. He said, there's a couple things you got to remember. He said, the way we're drinking this, he said, you always get the gin in a shot glass. And you get the squirt, the soda, in a chaser, separate glasses. What you do is you drink the gin down real fast, but never breathe. And the reason you don't want to breathe, it's nasty and it can gag you. Now, you know if you've ever drank any dry gin and you're sober, when you drink it, you know he's telling the truth. You get a good slug of that, it'll just send shivers through you. You got to be about half drunk to drink it. And I said, okay, Billy, that's fine with me. And he said, the other thing you got to do is you got to start to use a lot of pepper on your food. Now, I'm a pretty confused young man in those days, but even that, I mean, what will that do? And he said, well, the way we're drinking this gin, he said, it can hurt your liver real bad, but he said, if you use a lot of pepper on your food, it'll counteract any damage. I'm just telling you what he said. And now, we weren't eating much in those days anyway, but there was a couple of reasons I like to drink with those guys. One reason is when I was drinking, I had a big mouth. Plus, I'm a coward. Plus, my size is against me, right? Now, there isn't anything going to happen to me in Bill's bar, but sometimes we'd get drunk and wander off. Now, when I got sober, I went up a pant size a year for probably 3 or 4 years. I needed to. Billy Walker never was any bigger than I am right now, but he would attack people. You see that dog on the Greyhound bus? He'd fly on people and knock them out. That'd be the end of them. And the other reason I like to drink with him, I've never known exactly how to explain this, but I've seen a lot of guys in my life could get a lot of girls, but I've only seen 2 in my life that what it looked like to me is they attracted women. They didn't have to do anything. You know what I'm talking? They just go wherever they go. You hang out a little bit, and there's going to be women moving in. And I mean, I couldn't have possibly abstract this at that time, but I must just have been drunk and not stupid. Because my plan was, I'll stay right here with you, Billy, and possibly get in on some of the overflow. So I don't know whatever happened to those guys, but I can tell you this. The first Friday night in October of 2005, I was with Tom Ivester in Waco, Texas, at the Waco Roundup, right down the road from the George W. Bush Ranch. And I'm the Friday night speaker. And you know how the people come through the line at the... I saw this young woman coming through the line, and she had something on her mind. There was no doubt about that. You know how people will back the line up. They'll almost take a 5th step with you in line. Just thank the speaker and keep moving. You know, they'll back the line up. Well, they weren't even going to back up on her. She's coming through there. So she gets up there, and she says, I got to tell you something. She's really pumped. I said, what is it? She said, I know those Walker boys. I said, you've got to be kidding. That's not possible. She said, oh, trust me, I know them. And she said, I used to hang out with their little sister, but she gave me some information on how to get in touch with them if they were still living. She said in 1983, the last time she saw them, they were still going strong. I don't know how that's possible, but that's what she said. But anyway, I got to get sober here and spend the next couple hours talking about AA. But anyway, Thanksgiving season. Well, let me just back up with it. I come from a long line of alcoholics, and as I look back on my life now, it was very confusing. I watched my grandchildren learn how to read, and my youngest granddaughter is 7, and she's reading very well, but I watched all that while my kids, they're all grown. Grandkids are, my oldest granddaughter is going to Spain tomorrow for a Clemson project. I with her this morning, but I watched all of them learn how to read and put puzzles together and all of that. As far as I know, I never learned how to read. I just knew how to read. It seems like I came into the world knowing how to read. I could read really good, and I could read out loud really good, and I knew what words meant out of context that I didn't know how I knew what they meant, so they thought I was really smart. And what happened is in the 4th grade, they introduced a thing called long division. They might as well have been talking to me in Swahili. I mean, I couldn't anymore do long division than I could fly. And what happened, they didn't believe I couldn't do it. They took me to the principal's office, and they were not heavy-handed. My teacher was a very elegant old lady. My teacher and the principal of that little elementary grade school, Grant School, in that little community of less than 25,000 people, gave their entire lives to that school. But what they wanted to know is why I wouldn't cooperate and do that long division. And I wanted to know that too, but they didn't believe I wouldn't do it. And I think it was even the principal. You know, I'm sure she didn't mean this, but you know how people just say something to try to get you going? She said, you're smarter than I am. Why won't you do this? And I wondered that too, why I couldn't. And when I look back on it, I had a terrible time learning how to tie my shoes. Like, I can't read a map. If I get a flat tire, I'm just down till you get there. I just hate to hear anybody say, like, you can't miss it when they're giving you directions. I mean, I've actually stopped to pee before, got back in the car and went the wrong way. It's when I learned how to work the self-service pumps at the gas station, I thought I'd done a major coup. I was so happy. I was a child in the military, barely old enough to get in there when I first found out about disposable razors. And I was so glad because I'd had 2 or 3 already that I had to throw away because I couldn't figure out how to get the blade in them. So it was very confusing. Well, years later, now I don't want to brag about this, just going to present the facts. I'm actually a former ping pong champion, VA Psych Ward, Lincoln, Nebraska. And I was probably the only one in there who wasn't on Thorazine. But in that nut house, they pieced a lot of that together for me, which I'd already learned a bunch of stuff about that now. You know how, like if you ever process into a nut house or even treatment centers sometimes, or you can play with those things on the table at Cracker Barrel, those sequential kind of things, I could never do any of that. My youngest granddaughter, the one that's 7 now, she's been putting those puzzles together since she could barely old enough to crawl on the floor. And she'd just fly through putting those starter puzzles together. Well, if I got a piece of a starter puzzle, it was just by mistake. None of that makes any sense to me. But if you want to, and all they're trying to do with those tests when you process into one of those places is they're checking things like abstraction and how do you process stuff and do you have brain damage and all. If this is this, then this is this. So if you want to test me on something like that, you have to give me a community problem or you could give me a prison problem or something like that. I'm as smart as anybody else. But it doesn't make sense to me if like a map, a map makes less sense to me than speaking in Japanese. So it's all very confusing to me. And by the time I was 15 years old, my alcoholism was in full bloom. I come from a long line of alcoholics. Not many of those people ever said they were alcoholics, but trust me, they'll do till some come along. But anyway, by the time I got out of the military in the summer of 1972, I'm going to fast forward you. Thanksgiving season, 1974, I had just come back from California one more time. And a lady and her boyfriend at Bill's Bar invited another guy and I to their house for Thanksgiving dinner. Have you ever seen one of those wrecks, like a major wreck on the interstate or something where everybody should have got killed and nobody got a scratch? You ever seen one of those? I was actually in the sleeper of a tractor trailer when the trailer came around and jackknifed, crashed right above where my head was. You could look out and see the sky. I was passed out in the sleeper. The guy driving the truck said he watched the trailer come around in the mirror and he watched it jackknife and he said it didn't even spill the beer between his legs when it hit. But anyway, they had the highway patrol out there and the fire engines hosing off the diesel fuel and all. I slept through the whole thing. Nobody knew I was there except the guy driving the truck. I didn't even know I was there. But this lady and her boyfriend invited me and another guy, that guy, to their house for Thanksgiving dinner. Now, I'm sick like this. I remember stuff, but I don't know if it really happened or not. I wake up, I'm drenched in my own sweat, but I'm freezing. She's bringing in beer for me to sip. Every time I think I'm going to get well, I get sick again. So it's taken me like 3 or 4 hours to get well. My feet are all swollen up. I'm turning colors. Every time I go to the bathroom, blood comes out. Every time I vomit, blood comes out. This is what happened. This lady's name was Libby. Libby and her boyfriend were a permanent party at Bill's Bar. I'll tell you, this is a rough crowd because Sal, he was a bull hauler, and he wanted to marry Libby. Well, I knew she wasn't going to marry him. But he drug her across the river to Iowa to meet his mom. And Libby told me when Sal got up and went to the bathroom, Sal's mom pulled him into the kitchen and said, "Honey, let me tell you something." He said, "If you know what's good for you, you'll get as far away from that drunken bum as quick as you can because he'll ruin your life." Now, that's his mom talking. So it's a rough bunch, right? But Libby's heart was as big as all the Midwest. And this is what she said. She said, "I've been around alcoholics all my life." Now, you remember, her and her boyfriend are a permanent party at Bill's Bar. I believe then and now, you could get in there by mistake, but you wouldn't stay in there by mistake. It's not a place you'd go have a couple beers after work. You had to have something wrong with you to be hanging out in there. But so Libby and her boyfriend were a permanent party there, but she said that I've been around alcoholics all my life, but I don't think I've ever seen anything like you at your age. She said, "There's a man in town who helped my last ex-husband, who's now been sober 1 year, got a full-time job, paying his child support. He's doing really well. If you want me to, I'll call him." And everything come together just right because I think there's probably some people in this room can identify with that. I've always thought that one of the reasons, I've never met an alcoholic coming into AA that wasn't in deep spiritual distress. I've met some that it didn't look like they were, but when you get into the mire with them, they're in deep spiritual distress. I don't know how you could get in here if you weren't. It's a spiritual illness. So I think so many of us are mad and disenfranchised and blaming God and all of that. And I've always thought the reason for that is so many of us have tried to get help from God and we didn't get it. Now, we were all wrong on how we went about things. But I had some plans on how I was going to get out of the trouble I was in. I'm homeless for a couple years now. I had a plan. I was going to marry a rich woman. Even as confused as I was thinking, this is not looking good for the home team. This probably ain't going to happen. There were plenty of women in Bill's bar, and some of them probably even had some money, but I mean, where are you going to take them? I had to carry my toothbrush in my front pocket. I mean, I'm in trouble here. My other plan was I'm going to get a job, and I would go over that scenario day after day after day. I was out of the military, between AA and the military, almost 3 years. I only worked 6 weeks. So you can imagine it was pretty bleak. I was going to get a job, and that makes sense. I was always going to get a job tomorrow. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to sip a little bit of beer to take the edge off, and then I'm going to get a job. Well, that's like saying I'm not going to drive a car when I'm drinking. That makes perfect sense until I start drinking. Then it doesn't make sense anymore. And my third plan, which I would submit, was a lot more likely I was going to commit suicide. But here's what happened. She called a guy by the name of Bob Brannigan, who made the first call that was ever made on me, November 30th, 1974. He spent all Saturday afternoon with me. And what he did is he told me the story of what he used to be like, what happened, and what he was like now. If you ever wonder about the wisdom or the direct guidance from a power greater than ourselves, because what does a newcomer know when they come to Alcoholics Anonymous? Well, what they need to know is how we're guided to tell our stories. What we used to be like, what happened, and what we're like now. Now, they're probably not going to believe that. I didn't believe all of it. Must have believed enough of it to stay here. But that's what he did. And I went on many of those calls with him, because there was 6 months between that call and my getting sober, but I sobered up right at the end of real active 12-step work, where we were making calls in people's homes constantly. So I went on a lot of those calls, so I know what he did. I don't remember much of it that day, but I remember a couple things. I remember him telling me that he had a wife and 5 kids, but he lost his family over drinking. And he'd built a new house for him. He was a contractor. He was a sheet metal worker by trade. But he'd lost his home, the physical home, and he'd lost his wife and kids. And he said, and I should have lost them. I thought that was a little bit strange. I remember being a little bit confused by that. And I asked him, I guess anybody would want to know this if you didn't understand alcoholism. I asked him, I said, how do you get the willpower to not drink? And he said, I look on willpower a little bit different than you do. What willpower means to me is the way you take that drink knowing it's going to come back up. That's what I think willpower is. Remember that. And I remember asking him, how long since you've drank? And he said, if I can make it till September, it'll be 11 years. And I just talked to him a while back. I guess it's been, 54 years or something for him? I'm going to celebrate 43 years this month. So I think it's 54 or 5 years he's coming up on. He's still sober. 85 years old. He can't drive anymore because he can't see good enough. But his daughter takes him around. He still goes to meetings. I guess the reason he's still sober because he's still doing what he did with me. But on December 1st, 1974, he took me to the state hospital. And on the way, I needed a drink really bad. It was a couple, 3 hours away. There was another guy with us, 25 years old, just like me, that's now dead from drinking. But I needed a drink, but I didn't get one. He bought me a can of 7-Up and a carton of cigarettes. I had terrible cramps. And you know what I told him? I said, I'll pay you back. That great line. I guess it's the second biggest lie. The other big lie is what? I'll still like you in the morning, I suppose. But he bought me a carton of Marlboro cigarettes, and I remember telling him, I'll pay you back. And he looked over. You know, those cars from that time were about a half a block long. And he was holding the wheel like this, and he looked over, I guess, about as long as you could take your eyes off the road, and he said, that ain't the way this works. He said, you'll be expected to help someone else when you're able. Now, I didn't stay sober. I even got drunk in the state hospital. I was in jail a couple more times. Fast forward, Memorial Day weekend, 1975. The actual Memorial Day Monday, the date always changes. That year, it was May 26th. I woke up at 2 a.m. I had 2 bottles of wine, but I couldn't find them. You ever hide a bottle from yourself? That's a revolting development, I'll tell you. I couldn't find them. The guy who drank those 2 bottles of wine is dead now. I don't guess they killed him. It probably didn't help him any. But anyway, I didn't remember what had happened. And I saw this guy I'd been drinking with, and I said, well, what happened? He said, well, we were riding around with Richard. And you know, Richard's nerves are bad. Now, that could not be argued. Richard's nerves were bad. They were real bad. But he was always good to me. But he said that Richard told you 3 or 4 times to shut up. You wouldn't shut up. So he said, Richard hit you. I said, Richard hit me? He said, yeah, he hit you in the mouth hard too. I said, well, what did I do? He said, you started crying. I guess it made sense. I don't know. But anyway, that was right in that week period of time or something like that. I never have been exactly sure. Let's have to speed this up. My great aunt invited me to come and live with her. My great aunt was 75 years old in 1975. She spoke 3 languages. She spoke English fluently, obviously. She spoke Spanish fluently, and she spoke German fluently, and she was a lifelong student of Latin because of her love of words. If she were a young woman today, she'd be an attorney or a physician or something. It's a different time. But she said, I have someone in mind who will take you to AA if you will go. And so I'm going to meetings on a daily basis. And it was a great way to get sober, because what people told me was there's no failure in Alcoholics Anonymous. If there's any failure, it'll be because you don't do what you're supposed to do. That our founders have given us a plan of action that is absolutely more powerful than the illness of alcoholism. It's impossible to do both. It's impossible to practice these principles to the best of your ability and drink alcohol too. Now, could I get drunk? Of course I could get drunk. Any alcoholic could get drunk. But I'm not going to just walk off and get drunk. I have to pull out of the miracle. There's a lot of, alcoholism's a hard thing to grasp. It looks like, the way we talk about it sometimes, it's like we get drunk and then we get sick. That's not really what happens. Everybody that comes to this podium, we read almost every meeting that no human power could have relieved our alcoholism, but everybody who comes to the podium points their sobriety to people. And everybody that comes to the podium tells a story of being in deep trouble before they started drinking. So it's not like I got drunk and then got sick. I mean, I'm in bad trouble. It's like a hole of cold wind blowing through me. Well, when I drank alcohol, that hole filled up. And my life changed. I mean, I went from, all of a sudden life was fine. It's just that, and consequences were early on. It's just that they were worth it. If alcohol was still doing what it did for me as a 16 or 17 or 18-year-old kid, that's where I'd be tonight. Even at my age, I'd be in one of those broken down country western bars. I'd have some half-dressed slinkstress in there telling me how good I am. She'd know it was a lie, and I would too. But the bar ain't exactly about honesty, You're sitting in there talking to your best friend, perhaps another doctor or airline pilot, that you met a couple hours ago. But anyway, I started in on the steps, and that first step, it was very clear, where it said, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. What that dash means is a new thought. So what that really means in layman's terms is I'm having trouble drinking, I'm having trouble not drinking. Now, I don't want to hit you with anything too heavy tonight, but that means you're screwed. Is what that means. That means you're in a lot of trouble. Now, as far as I know, I've never seen in any AA literature where there's any reference that one step is any more important than any other step. They're all of equal importance to the well-ordered life, and the first step may be the price of admission, but it's a terrible place to stay, because there's no hope there. If you hang around that first step too long, that's why we lose so many people. They come here or whatever. You got to get off of that first step. And I think what happened to me, I could have never put this in words at the time, but the very first summer that I was sober, I think the elements of the second step started to move in my life. Came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. And I don't think that the sanity that the second step is talking about. Now, I did some crazy things when I was drinking. There's a place in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous. Well, and I'm going to tell that story about that woman just for you. There's a place in the book, Alcoholics. My wife hates that story. I told it one time with her here. She came with me. I spoke at one of the anniversaries. I told that story. But there's a place in the book, Alcoholics Anonymous, that says the drinking career of most alcoholics has had some stuff happen that's hilarious, and they've had some stuff happen that's tragic. I'm going to tell you a hilarious story. If you don't like this story, don't think anything of it, or don't tell me about it if you don't like the story anyway. I was up, and you know how if you have something embarrassing happen, you're glad your sponsor's not there? Tom and I were in Rhode Island a few years ago doing this workshop where you talk on the steps all weekend, and I told this story. Well, I'll just be as kind as I can. This woman, large woman, didn't like the story. And Tom said, don't listen to that junk. If you want to tell that story, just tell it. So I figure if I can get the story past Tom, Tom was a moralist. If you know Tom, he's a moralist. But he said the story was all right. But anyway, I'm up in the state of Washington, and I go in this bar with this woman. Now, I'm driving a very long white car. I can't remember what kind of car it was, but it was a big white car. We get out of the car and go into the bar. Now, this woman was not ugly. She, however, was old. I told this story one night in Decatur, Alabama, on the radio, right down there in that front row where Waylon is sitting, said, "You mean mature, don't you?" And I said, No, I don't mean mature. But anyway, what happened is most of this was put together by the Highway Patrol. A couple hours later, we came out of the bar. We got in another white car and left. But in those days, I never took the keys out of a car, so I left the car I had drove to the bar there, and I left in somebody else's car. So that woman and I was picked up for auto theft and drunk driving. Took me a long time to figure out what had happened. I could see the drunk driving. I couldn't figure out how they picked me up for stealing the car. But they put us, the Highway Patrol picked us up, took us to this little bitty country town outside of Spokane, Washington. They put this woman and I in the same jail cell. That's all they had there. It's one little cell. And they tried to get to the bottom of what happened. Well, the next morning they let us out. And you know how you tell something so many times you can't remember? This story is absolutely literal in every respect, except I think they even gave us the beer back. I think. That's the only part I'm uncertain on. But the next morning we got out of jail and the patrolman's talking to me, and you know how they talk to you, like this. And he's jabbing me, and he's telling me, "You're too drunk to drive. She has to drive." And I'm sure I'm saying, "You're right, boss. That's right." And it's okay. So she's walking. She's probably about to the back of the room. And he lets me go, starts walking. I start walking behind her to the car. Now, she had on these little bitty white shorts, and about half her butt, at least, was coming out the bottom of those shorts. Is rough. I ain't lying. And I don't know why I did this. I have no idea why I did this, but I turned around and looked at the patrolman. And when I did, our eyes just locked. You know how your eyes will lock with somebody like in a restaurant or even in an AA meeting? Your eyes we were just locked like that. And that patrolman went like this. He went. And I thought, buddy, you think it's rough from where you're at. How would you like to be me? And now, to be fair, that woman had about the same thing on her hands with me. Now, that wasn't funny then. It's funny now. And then there's some tragedy that happened. My alcoholism was a good bit responsible for somebody else's death. So when we come, you've got to get from the first to the second step. The second step is a step of hope. That a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. It's not the crazy things I did when I was drinking. I was in 2 car wrecks one time. Anybody who's drunk, if you feel Granny full of Mad Dog wine, she'll do crazy stuff too. I think the insanity that the second step is talking about and the restoration of sanity is not taking a drink while I'm sober, believing that this time it would be different. I think that's what they're talking about. So my first run through the steps, my sponsor took me by the hand. We got down on our knees, and he said, "We're going to say the 3rd step prayer. Are you willing to turn your will and your life over to the care of God?" I said, "I'm certainly willing to do that, but I don't know what that means." And this is what he told me. And this is still good enough today. It's a little deeper maybe sometimes than this today, but it's good enough. He said, "Your will is your thinking, and your life is your actions. And we're not going to worry about your thinking. We're going to worry about what you do. We're going to worry about you taking the right action." AA is about an action program. It's not much about the head. It's more about the heart than anything else. And so he said, if you don't know what to do, then you ask me and I'll tell you. And so that's what we did. We said the 3rd step prayer. And if you read the 3rd step in the big book, it talks about destruction of self-centeredness. Now, I don't know. This is just my take on it, and any speaker should say. I certainly don't speak for Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm not an authority on alcoholism. I'm not a counselor. I'm nothing. I'm just a guy that AA's worked awfully well for. But if you look at the whole self-centered thing, I don't know of anything more self-centered than active alcoholism. And the reason for that is because push comes to shove, a drink will always win. It wins out over everything else. So it's the epitome of self-centeredness. And if you look at the 3rd step in the 12 and 12, it's talking about willingness. So it would seem like those two things would be what we're trying. We're trying to be willing, and we're trying to move into a life where we're not as self-centered as we were. So I went into the 4th step. I wrote down every filthy, rotten, corruptible thing I'd ever done. I covered it like the book says: resentments, fear, and sex. And then I always tell people to put down any other secrets you got. And I called up a guy that was a member of Alcoholics Anonymous, long-term member. I did my first fifth step sober with a Catholic priest. And the reason I did that, I'm a Catholic, but I didn't care anything about being a Catholic. But the reason I did that, I had it in my head that a priest couldn't tell. I didn't know that that's only in the confessional. I didn't know that he was bound by nothing else. But it was perfect for me. He told me to read it. He'd been sober many years. He told me to meet him at the rectory at 9 a.m. Saturday morning. I was there at 10 minutes to 9. And I left at 12 o'clock noon, different. And I had a lot of stuff to pour through in there. That's a funny undertaking. I had to get through that death. I had to get through all kinds of stuff. And I also had something on there that it probably wasn't even in the worst 100 things I've ever done. But for somehow, it was bigger than life until I told it to him. And somehow he knew something about that, and he said he wanted to... He told me when we started, he said, it's important to remember that you're in here with me and God. And I'm in here essentially as a listener. If I've got something to say, I'll say it. But when I told him that thing, it was like something left me, and he wanted to review. He knew something about that. And my experience, I've heard my share at least of fifth steps. 90% of what people, this is just my experience now, 90% of what people intend to take to the grave with them has to do with sex. And that's why I think our founders told us to treat sex as we would any other problem. Because it's so loaded with so much mania that unless we get it down there where it's practical and become responsible, then we've got too much stuff attached to it. But when I left there that day, never forget this. I had when I left there, it was a two-pronged thing. I left there with the idea that I'd come a considerable distance. Anybody that's willing to go into a room with God and another human being and tell everything that you've been lying about it for years. I heard a guy say one time, he said, let me see if I got this right. You want me to write down all this stuff that I've been lying to a psychiatrist about for years and tell it to a plumber? And he said, that's exactly what I expect you to do. Well, that doesn't make any sense unless you understand alcoholism. But when I left there that day, it was like I'd come a considerable distance. And the other thought right with that I think parallel to that's just as important, I'm going to say this, you have to take this, you have to filter this a little bit. I've always thought that as a fellowship, we're a little bit over-identified with the fourth and fifth step. It's not as bad as it used to be because the treatment's not as prominent as it was at one time. The fourth and fifth steps are extremely important, but they're 2 of 12. All the steps are important. And so when I was leaving there that day, it became apparent to me that this would be a bad place to pull out. Now stick with me on this thought and consider it if you're interested. It seems like to me this is where we start to lose our members. Because if something doesn't happen when you move into 6 and 7, then people start to go backwards and move out of AA. And it looks like that they leave at steps 8 and 9, but they really leave earlier than that. They just dance around 8 and 9 a little bit before they leave. Something has to happen. There's some kind of transition, it seems to me, that has to happen at 6 and 7 that's almost like to your life, like the first step is to your alcoholism. So the 6th step, we're entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. And step 7, humbly asked him to remove our shortcomings. You don't have to be in AA very long to know they're the least talked about steps. And they're also the least practiced. They look like filler material. But it's really where the heavy lifting begins. It's like the question is, do you want to get well or don't you? Because all this stuff that's been making a problem drinker out of me to the beginning, all this stuff that's been tormenting me since a child has to be dealt with now, and I don't have booze to deal with it. That's why a lot of times when you quit drinking, for a while things get worse. For a little while, till you get a hold of stuff. But anyway, it was clear to me that was a place to anchor down, and so I went on with the steps and. Tell you one quick story about steps 8 and 9. Step 8 is made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. And 9 is made direct amends. Well, anyway, you know what they are, 8 and 9. One quick story. I wasn't even at step 9 yet when I did this. I didn't know any better at that time, but I had stolen a guy's snowmobile suit. And in Nebraska, in the winter, the people who work on construction, can be below zero. So they wear these things called snowmobile suits to keep them from freezing to death. Well, I had stole this guy's snowmobile suit. Now, I don't know how it ever came back to me when I got sober, but it did. That lady, Libby, had a box of stuff of mine, and it was in there. Well, I knew who it was, so I borrowed this guy's car. I don't even think I had a driver's license yet. I went down to the south end of town where this guy lived there. His name was Hartman, too. Vibrator liked me. This guy didn't like me. So I go up on his porch. I pulled up on the wrong side of the road, left the car running and the door open, went up on the porch. And I hit the door, and Hartman's standing in the door. I'm looking up at him. Now I'm real nervous. I don't know enough at that time. I'm brand new. I shouldn't be doing this yet. But I just say, Hartman, I just blurted out, I stole your snowmobile suit. I feel terrible about it. I'm in AA. I'm trying to get sober. I hope you'll forgive me. Now, as nervous as I was, he got nervous. He said, what's your name? Hartman knows me, right? And he said something about how much they cost, and he had to buy some more, and he ought to do something about it. And I just try to get out of there as quick as I can. I'm scared to death. That's like on a Wednesday or Thursday. Saturday night, I'm sitting in the AA meeting. Just before the meeting starts, about like what time it is right now, a couple minutes to 8, Hartman walks in the door. I saw him come in. Walked in the back door, chapter 5. He saw me, and he looked over at me, and he didn't exactly nod his head like that, but it was imperceptible. He did a little baby nod, acknowledged me. Hartman sat through the meeting. Right after the meeting was over with, he participated in the Lord's Prayer. Right when the meeting was over with, he came right for me across the room, stuck out his hand. He said, I thought about what you did, and he said, I just want to tell you how much I appreciate that, and that I believe you're very sincere. And I hope this works out for you and you can go on with your life. Now, I don't know what that did to Hartman. He should have been in AA himself. I never saw him again, but I tell that story. I don't have time to tell other stories like that, but I tell that story to say alcoholism has the power to kill people that don't even drink it. It destroys families and people that don't even drink it. These principles, and I'm not trying to be otherworldly and say I put Hartman's life back together. That didn't happen. But what I'm saying is our change has power to impact other people. Whatever you send out in life comes back. If you're sending out trash, trash comes back. If you're sending out love, love comes back. So, I went on with the steps. I've had all kinds of experience with those. I've had all kinds of experiences in life, period. I didn't work much the first year, and then a guy recruited me. I went to work in the court system. I didn't meet any of the qualifications. The guy that hired me said, they're going to tell you can't be hired. Don't fill out an application. Don't argue with anybody that says you can't, because you don't meet any of this stuff. He said, the politics are such, but he said, I got it. Just just hang out. I got it. And so January 23rd of 1977, I went to work for state probation. Here I am on a Sunday. I'm fat, dumb, and happy. Monday, I'm an officer of the court. And my life was never the same. I've had all the stuff happen here that everybody else has. I've made every mistake, but I think there's 3 mistakes I haven't made. I haven't drank since I got sober. I've never quit going to AA meetings, and I've never trusted the wrong person. AA is one of the few places in the world where you get to pick your leaders. I had some management training one time that said if you work for a man or woman that you wouldn't hire, if the shoe was on the other foot, you're going to have trouble every time. And those of us who've been in state government know they're telling the truth. I had some people in charge of me. I wouldn't let them plug lamps in if it was up to me. They were in charge of me, but I didn't do what they said. But anyway, I say all of that to say that Alcoholics Anonymous has given me everything I have in life. My kids are all grown with college educations. One of them's got 3 college degrees. My grandkids have never seen me drink. I've had 2 wives. This one's the best of the 2. She's still a problem. Had her for 20 years. But I've been overpaid in every department. I've been able to participate in life and take my place because of Alcoholics Anonymous. So I appreciate the invitation, Waylon. I appreciate being here, and you've been a great listening audience. Anybody that's tried to do much speaking knows you can't talk into a group that won't participate with you through listening. So you've been a great listening crowd. Thank you for my life.